He had promised he would be home by midnight. That was what Matteo Rossi told his wife, Elena, when he kissed her forehead that morning, his hand lingering briefly on her shoulder before he left their bedroom. She had nodded, not asking where he was going or why it mattered that he returned by midnight specifically. She had learned years ago that questions often went unanswered, and the answers that came were rarely complete. So she simply said she would wait, and he had smiled at her the way he always did when she made things easy for him. By 11 that night, Elena sat in the living room of their estate, a book open in her lap that she had not read a single word of. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily, each sound marking time that felt increasingly hollow. She glanced at her phone. No messages, no calls. She told herself it was still early, that he had said midnight, and there was still time. But something in her chest had already begun to tighten, a familiar feeling she had become accustomed to over the years of their marriage. Midnight came and went. The house remained silent except for the clock and the distant sound of wind against the windows. Elena did not call him. She did not send a message asking where he was. She simply sat there, staring at the phone in her hand, understanding with a clarity that felt almost physical that this night was different. Not because he had broken a promise, he had done that before. Not because he had chosen something else over her, that had become routine. This night was different because she finally allowed herself to see what had been true for a long time. She was alone. She had been alone, and waiting for him to come home would not change that. She set the phone down on the table beside her and closed the book she had not been reading. Then she stood, turned off the lights in the living room, and walked upstairs to their bedroom. She did not cry. She did not feel anger rising in her throat. She felt something quieter and more final. She felt understanding. When Matteo finally arrived home at 4 in the morning, the house was dark and still. He moved quietly through the hallway, removing his jacket and loosening his tie. He expected Elena to be asleep. He had prepared an explanation in his mind during the drive home, something about complications that could not be avoided, about responsibilities that demanded his attention. He had used similar explanations before, and they had always been accepted. Not happily, perhaps, but accepted nonetheless. He opened the bedroom door carefully, trying not to wake her. In the dim light filtering through the window, he could see her shape beneath the covers, her back turned toward his side of the bed. He undressed quietly and slipped under the sheets, careful not to disturb her. For a moment, he considered reaching out to touch her shoulder, to whisper an apology or an explanation. But fatigue settled over him, and he told himself it could wait until morning. There would be time tomorrow. There was always time. Elena was not asleep. She lay perfectly still, aware of every sound he made as he entered the room, aware of the moment he settled into bed beside her, aware of the space between them that felt wider than it had ever been. She kept her breathing steady and even, giving him no reason to speak. She did not want his explanations tonight. She did not want his justifications or his apologies. She wanted to hold on to this new clarity she had found, this understanding that had crystallized during the hours of waiting. She needed to protect it, to let it settle completely before anything could disturb it. Morning came with pale light filtering through the curtains. Matteo woke to find Elena's side of the bed empty. He sat up, rubbing his face, feeling the heaviness of too little sleep. He could hear sounds downstairs, the quiet clatter of dishes, the soft murmur of voices. His children. He had almost forgotten it was Saturday. When he came downstairs, Elena was in the kitchen with their 2 children. Marco, who was 12, sat at the table eating cereal and reading something on a tablet. Sophia, who was 9, was helping her mother set out plates. The scene was ordinary, domestic, peaceful. Elena looked up when he entered, and for a brief moment their eyes met. He expected to see reproach there, or hurt, or anger. Instead, he saw something he could not quite identify, something that looked almost like resignation. "Good morning," she said, her voice pleasant and neutral. "Good morning," he replied, waiting for more, waiting for the question about where he had been, why he had come home so late, why he had broken his promise. The question never came. Elena turned back to the counter, pouring orange juice into glasses. She said, "There's coffee, and I made breakfast if you're hungry." He poured himself coffee and sat down at the table. Marco glanced up at him briefly, offered a small nod, and then returned to his tablet. Sophia smiled at him but said nothing. The breakfast proceeded in near silence, punctuated only by small requests to pass the butter or the jam. Matteo kept waiting for Elena to say something, to reference the previous night, to ask him about his absence, but she engaged in light conversation with the children about their plans for the day, about a school project Marco needed to work on, about Sophia's upcoming dance recital. It should have been a relief. Instead, Matteo felt a growing unease he could not name. He told himself he was being paranoid, that he should be grateful Elena was not making a scene, not demanding explanations he would have found difficult to give. But the ease with which she moved through the morning, the complete absence of tension in her voice or her movements, disturbed something in him. He was accustomed to her disappointment, to her quiet hurt. This neutrality was something else entirely. The weekend passed in similar fashion. Elena was pleasant, efficient, present with the children. She spoke to Matteo when necessary, asked him practical questions about schedules and household matters, responded to his comments with appropriate replies. But there was a quality to her presence that had shifted. She was there, but she was not waiting. She was not checking her phone, not organizing her time around his potential arrival or departure. She simply lived through the hours with a self-containment that seemed absolute. Matteo told himself he was imagining things. Elena had always been composed, always been capable of managing the household and the children without his constant involvement. That was one of the things he had appreciated about her when they married. She understood his work demanded his attention, that his responsibilities extended far beyond their home. She was never the type to make demands or issue ultimatums. This was simply Elena being Elena. Nothing had changed. But something had changed, though it would take him weeks to fully recognize it. The change was not in what Elena did. She continued to manage the household, to care for the children, to maintain the routines that kept their family functioning. The change was in what she no longer did. She no longer waited up for him when he came home late. She no longer called to ask when he would return. She no longer made plans that included him unless he specifically confirmed his availability. She had stopped reaching across the distance between them, stopped trying to pull him closer, stopped hoping that someday things would be different. At first, Matteo experienced this shift as a kind of freedom. Elena had become easier, less complicated. There were no more difficult conversations, no more moments when he saw disappointment in her eyes and felt the weight of it. She smiled at him across the dinner table when he made it home for dinner. She responded warmly when he remembered to ask about her day. She maintained the appearance of their marriage with such skill that he almost did not notice how little substance remained beneath the surface. His business consumed his attention as it always had. There were territories to manage, agreements to negotiate, problems to solve. Matteo had built his position through strategic thinking and decisive action, and he prided himself on his ability to see several moves ahead, to anticipate consequences before they materialized. In his professional life, he was meticulous about maintaining control, about ensuring loyalty, about protecting what was his. It was his youngest lieutenant, Franco, who first planted the seed of doubt. They were reviewing security arrangements for a shipment when Franco mentioned something about his own wife being angry with him for missing their anniversary dinner. "Women remember these things," Franco said, shaking his head. "Even when you think they've forgiven you, they're keeping score." Matteo laughed, made some comment about the price of the life they had chosen, but later, driving home through the city streets, Franco's words echoed in his mind. Elena never kept score. She never threw past disappointments in his face, never compiled lists of his failures as a husband. She simply absorbed each absence, each broken promise, each moment when something else took priority over her. And now, he realized with sudden discomfort, that she had stopped absorbing them. She had stopped caring enough to be hurt. When he finally arrived home that night, earlier than usual, some impulse drove him to walk through the door before midnight. Elena was in the living room, reading. She looked up when he entered, offering him a smile that was polite and distant. "You're home early," she said.
"I finished earlier than expected." He remained standing in the doorway, studying her. "How was your day?"
"It was good.
Sophia had her dance class. Marco is upstairs working on that history project. She returned her attention to her book. Alina. She looked up again, her expression attentive but unrevealing. Is everything all right? Of course. Why do you ask? He could not articulate why. Nothing was wrong, exactly. Everything was functioning as it should. I just wanted to make sure. Everything is fine, Matteo. I'm just tired. I think I'll go to bed soon. She stood, placed her book on the side table, and kissed his cheek as she passed him in the doorway. The kiss was brief, automatic, devoid of any particular feeling. He watched her climb the stairs, disappearing into the darkness of the upper floor, and felt something cold settle in his chest. Weeks turned into months, and the pattern solidified. Elena moved through their life with calm efficiency, a woman who had made peace with disappointment by simply ceasing to expect anything different. She attended Sophia's dance recitals alone, sitting in the audience with other mothers, applauding at the right moments. She helped Marco with his homework at the kitchen table in the evenings, her patience endless as she explained concepts he struggled with. She maintained the house, managed the staff, organized the family schedule. She performed every function of a wife, except the one that mattered most. She had stopped truly seeing Matteo as her husband. He had become a person she lived with, a man who shared her home and her children, but not her emotional life. The children adjusted to this new reality more quickly than Matteo did. Marco, entering adolescence, became absorbed in his own world of school and friends and the private concerns of a 12-year-old. He spoke to his father with respect when Matteo was home, answered questions about school and sports, but volunteered little beyond what was asked. Sophia, younger and more emotionally transparent, still sought her father's attention when he appeared, but she no longer ran to the door when she heard him arrive. She no longer asked when he would be home or made special drawings to show him. She had learned, as children do, to adjust her expectations to reality. It was Marco who finally forced Matteo to confront what he had been avoiding. The boy had a soccer game on a Saturday afternoon, an important match that would determine whether his team advanced in their league. Matteo had promised to attend. Elena had mentioned it several times that week, carefully noting the time and the location without asking him to confirm, without expressing hope or expectation, just providing information. The morning of the game, Matteo received a call. There was a problem with a business arrangement, a complication that required his immediate attention. It would take a few hours, he was told. He looked at his watch. The game was at 2 in the afternoon. If he handled this quickly, he could still make it. He told Elena he had something urgent to address, but that he would meet them at the field. She nodded, gathering her things, calling for the children. "We'll save you a seat," she said, her tone making it clear she did not expect the seat to be filled. The business took longer than anticipated. Complications multiplied, requiring calls and consultations and decisions. Matteo kept checking his watch, calculating whether he could still make it to the field before the game ended. 2 o'clock came and went. 3 o'clock arrived. By the time he finished dealing with the situation, it was nearly 4. The game would be over. He drove to the field anyway, some instinct telling him he needed to be there, even if he had missed the match. When he arrived, the parking lot was nearly empty. A few families remained, children still in their uniforms, parents gathering equipment. He saw Elena's car and walked toward the field. Elena stood near the bleachers, talking to another mother. Sophia sat on the lowest bench, swinging her legs. Marco stood apart from them, his soccer bag slung over his shoulder, his uniform dirty from the game. Matteo approached, raising his hand in greeting. Marco saw him first. For a moment, their eyes met. Matteo saw his son's expression shift through several emotions: recognition, a brief flash of something that might have been hope, then a resignation that looked far too old for a 12-year-old face. Marco turned away without acknowledging him and walked toward his mother. Elena excused herself from her conversation and joined the children. She saw Matteo approaching, and her expression remained neutral. The game ended about 20 minutes ago. Marco's team won. He scored the winning goal. Pride and regret hit Matteo simultaneously. "That's excellent, Marco. I'm sorry I missed it. Something came up that I couldn't avoid." "It's fine," Marco said. "It's not fine. I wanted to be here." "You wanted to be here," Marco repeated, his voice flat. "But you weren't." The simple truth of the statement landed like a blow. Elena touched Marco's shoulder gently. "Let's go home. We can celebrate there." They walked to the car, Elena and the children moving together as a unit, Matteo following slightly behind. He wanted to say something, to bridge the distance that had opened between him and his son in that brief exchange, but he could not find the words. Marco's observation had been delivered without anger or accusation. That was what made it devastating. The boy had simply stated a fact. His father wanted to be there, but was not. It was a pattern Marco had learned to accept, just as Elena had learned to accept it, just as Sophia was learning to accept it. That night, after the children were in bed, Matteo found Elena in the kitchen. She was making tea, moving through the familiar motions with the ease of long habit. "I need to do better," he said. She turned to look at him, her expression gentle but not encouraging. "Matteo, you are who you are. Your work is demanding, we understand that." "But I'm missing everything. Marco scored the winning goal and I wasn't there to see it." "No, you weren't. But you're here now. That should count for something." "Does it?" She was quiet for a long moment, considering her answer. "I think you want it to count for more than it does." "What does that mean?" "It means that being here now, after missing the game, is not the same as being at the game. You know that, and Marco knows that. And trying to make yourself feel better by being here now, by expressing regret, doesn't change what happened this afternoon." "So what am I supposed to do?" "I don't know, Matteo. I can't answer that for you. I'm going to read for a while before bed. Good night." She left him standing in the kitchen, her words echoing in his mind. She had not been cruel, she had not been angry, she had simply been honest in a way that made it impossible for him to deflect or rationalize. Being there after the fact was not the same as being there when it mattered. He knew this, he had always known this, but he had told himself that his family understood, that his absence was necessary, that they would be there when he finally had time to return to them. What if they were not there anymore? Not physically gone, but gone in the way Elena had gone, present but unreachable, still performing their roles, but no longer emotionally invested in his participation. The thought disturbed him more than he wanted to admit, but business continued to demand his attention, and it was easier to focus on problems he knew how to solve than to confront the problem growing in his own home. Months passed. Elena's birthday arrived. Matteo had made plans this time, determined to show her that he could prioritize her, that he had learned from past failures. He made reservations at the restaurant where they had celebrated their engagement, arranged for a sitter to stay with the children, even purchased a gift himself rather than delegating the task to an assistant. The morning of her birthday, he kissed her and told her to be ready at 7. She smiled and thanked him, and for a moment he thought he saw something in her eyes that resembled the warmth she used to have when she looked at him. At 6 o'clock that evening, his phone rang. One of his oldest associates, a man who had been with him since the beginning, needed to meet urgently. There was a situation developing that could not wait. Decisions needed to be made within hours, not days. Matteo explained that tonight was impossible, that he had commitments. The associate's voice grew tense. This was not something that could be postponed. Decisions needed to be made within hours, not days. Matteo looked at his watch. If the meeting was brief, he might only be an hour late. He could still salvage the evening. He called Elena. "I have something I need to handle. I'll be a little late. Can you push the reservation to 8? There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Of course." "I'll be there, Elena. I promise. This won't take long." "All right." The meeting was not brief. The situation was more complex than his associate had described. involving multiple parties and conflicting interests. Matteo found himself mediating, negotiating, solving problems that multiplied the longer they talked. He kept checking his watch, calculating whether he could still make it to the restaurant before the dinner ended. 7 o'clock, 7:30, 8 o'clock. Roommates who parented together but shared little else. Sometimes he caught himself watching Elena, seeing glimpses of the woman he had fallen in love with, and felt the loss acutely. She was still beautiful, still intelligent, still capable, but she had become unreachable in ways that had nothing to do with physical distance. One night, Marco asked him a question at dinner. "Dad, are you and Mom getting divorced?" The question hung in the air. Elena set down her fork, waiting to see how Matteo would respond. Sophia looked between her parents, her eyes worried. "Why do you ask that?" Matteo said carefully. "Because you're here more now, but you and Mom don't really talk to each other, like my friends' parents. You're nice to each other, but it's like you're being polite, not like you're married." Matteo looked at Elena. She met his gaze steadily, neither confirming nor denying their son's observation. "Your mother and I are working through some things," Matteo said finally. "Sometimes marriages go through difficult periods. But you're not separating." "Not right now, no." Marco seemed satisfied with this answer, returning to his dinner. But Sophia looked less convinced, her young face troubled. After dinner, she approached Matteo hesitantly. "Daddy, did I do something wrong?" He picked her up, holding her close. "No, sweetheart, why would you think that?" "Because you and Mommy seem sad, and I thought maybe if I was better at dance, or if I was quieter, maybe you wouldn't be sad." His heart broke hearing her words, understanding that his children had been absorbing the tension in the household, trying to make sense of the distance between their parents, and wondering if they were somehow responsible. "Listen to me, Sophia. Nothing about this is your fault. Not yours, not Marco's. Your mother and I love you both very much. The problems we have are between us, and they have nothing to do with how wonderful you are." She hugged him tightly, and he held her, feeling the weight of all his failures pressing down on him. He had damaged his marriage. He had not only damaged his marriage, he had created an environment where his children worried they were somehow responsible for their parents' unhappiness. That night, he confronted Elena. "Sophia thinks she's the reason we're having problems. She thinks if she was better, we wouldn't be sad." Elena's face crumpled, the careful composure she maintained cracking. "I'll talk to her. I'll make sure she understands this isn't about her. This can't continue. Not like this. The children are suffering." "I know." She sat down heavily on the couch. "I know. So what do we do?" "I don't know, Matteo. Do we stay together for them? Do we separate and hope they adjust? Neither option seems right." They sat in silence, two people who had once loved each other enough to build a life together, now unable to find a path forward that did not involve pain.
"I destroyed this," Matteo said quietly. "I destroyed us, and I don't know how to fix it." "You can't fix it. That's what I've been trying to tell you. Some things break in ways that can't be repaired." She looked at him, her eyes wet. "I loved you so much, for so long. I waited and hoped and believed that eventually you would see me, really see me, and choose me. But you never did. And now I've protected myself by simply not loving you that way anymore. And I don't know if I can let myself love you again even if I wanted to, because I know what happens. I know how that story ends." "So we just give up?" "I think we accepted reality. We can be partners in raising our children. We can be civil and respectful. But the marriage we had, the one I wanted, that's gone. And I don't think either of us has the strength to build something different." Matteo understood then that there would be no dramatic reconciliation, no moment when everything suddenly became clear and they found their way back to each other. Elena had made her peace with disappointment by accepting it as unchangeable. She would stay or she would go, but either way, the woman who had loved him with hope and trust and vulnerability was gone. He had slowly killed that version of her through accumulated absence, and mourning her now could not bring her back. The seasons changed. Matteo continued his efforts to be present for Marco and Sofia, and they responded to his consistency with cautious trust. They began to expect him at their events, to include him in their plans, to share their lives with him in small but meaningful ways. He discovered pleasures he had been missing: Sofia's sense of humor, Marco's thoughtful observations about the world, the simple satisfaction of being part of their daily lives. But with Elena, the distance remained. They functioned as a team when it came to the children, coordinating schedules and discussing concerns. They shared meals and household responsibilities. To anyone observing from outside, they might have appeared to be a normal couple navigating the challenges of marriage and family, but between them lay years of hurt that neither could bridge. Elena had rebuilt herself without him, and she was not willing to risk that reconstruction by hoping again. One evening, Matteo found an old photo album in his study. He opened it, flipping through images of their early years together. Elena on their wedding day, radiant and hopeful. Elena pregnant with Marco, her hand resting on her swollen belly, her eyes full of anticipation. Elena holding newborn Sofia, exhausted and beautiful. In every photograph, he saw the love she had carried for him, the trust that he would protect and honor it. He saw himself in those photos too, younger, confident, always standing slightly apart, his attention partially elsewhere, even in moments that should have commanded his full presence. Even then, he had been dividing himself, never quite fully available, never quite completely there. He had thought he could have everything: his work, his power, his family, without having to choose. He had believed that Elena would always be there, that her love was inexhaustible, that he could return to her whenever he had time and find her waiting. He had been wrong. Love was not inexhaustible. It required care and attention and nurturing. It required presence. It required being chosen, and he had failed to provide any of those things with enough consistency to matter. Closing the album, Matteo acknowledged a truth he had been avoiding. The night he had promised to be home by midnight and arrived at 4 a.m. had not destroyed his marriage. It had simply revealed what had already been true for years. Elena had been alone in their marriage long before that night. That night had merely been the moment when she finally accepted it. He could not undo his choices. He could not recover the years of presence he had failed to give. He could be a better father to his children, and he would be, but Elena was lost to him in ways that no amount of change could remedy. She had survived his absence by learning not to need him, and asking her to need him again was asking her to make herself vulnerable to the same pattern of disappointment she had already endured. She loved herself too much now to risk that. The understanding settled over him like a weight. He had believed that realizing his mistakes would be the catalyst for change, that seeing what he had lost would enable him to recover it. But life was not that simple. Some losses were permanent. Some damage could not be undone. Elena would stay or she would go, but either way, the marriage they had begun with, full of hope and trust and mutual choosing, was over. He had ended it through years of small abandonments, and recognizing that now could not resurrect what he had killed through negligence. Matteo stood at the window of his study, looking out at the city lights, understanding that power and control and strategic thinking could solve many problems, but could not solve this one. He had built an empire, commanded respect, made decisions that affected countless lives, but he had failed at the one thing that mattered most. He had failed to protect the love his wife had given him, and now when he finally understood its value, it was too late, not because Elena hated him or wanted revenge, but because she had simply moved on to survive. She had become someone who did not need him, and he had no one to blame but himself.